Logan Hayes only meant to order coffee and toast, like any regular customer, but the recording device hidden under his napkin and the notepad gave away the truth. He was watching someone. Waitress Carmen served him with a tired smile, unaware that her every step and gesture was being observed. When she turned away, Logan saw her quietly slip some tip money into her pocket. He froze completely, not because of the theft, but because of why she was doing it. What he'd just overheard would change everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. The whispered words, "for my daughter's medicine," still echoed in his ears. The morning shift at Miller's Corner Cafe had barely begun when Logan Hayes settled into the booth by the window, positioning himself with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 15 years in law enforcement. The red vinyl seats were cracked with age, and the Formica table bore the coffee ring stains of countless conversations. Sunlight streamed through windows that could have used a good cleaning, casting everything in a hazy, almost nostalgic glow that reminded him of diners from his childhood. He ordered the simplest thing on the menu, black coffee and wheat toast, from a waitress whose name tag read Carmen. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days, and eyes that held the particular exhaustion of someone juggling too many responsibilities. Her uniform was clean, but showed signs of multiple washings, the fabric slightly faded at the seams. Logan had been hired by the cafe owner, Ray Thompson, after several employees had complained about missing tip money. Thompson was a decent man in his 60s who had run the place for over 20 years, and the allegations troubled him deeply. He'd considered installing security cameras, but the building's elderly landlord prohibited any permanent modifications to the electrical system, and basic battery-powered cameras had proved ineffective in the past, vandalized by disgruntled employees or customers who valued their privacy. A few days of professional investigation seemed like the more practical solution. What Logan hadn't expected was how the case would hit so close to home. As Carmen moved between tables with practiced efficiency, he couldn't help but notice the way she checked her phone constantly, the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking, and the careful way she counted and recounted the tips left on each table. The small recording device in his jacket pocket felt heavier with each passing minute. In his 15 years as a detective before going private, he'd caught plenty of thieves, but most of them had been motivated by greed, addiction, or simple opportunism. This felt different. Carmen's nervous energy wasn't that of someone planning to get rich quick. It was the desperation of someone drowning. His own daughter's voice echoed in his memory from their conversation the night before. 6-year-old Zoe had asked him why he looked so sad lately, why he worked so many hours, why Mommy wasn't coming back. The questions that cut deeper than any criminal's confession ever could. Logan pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photo of Zoe on her first day of kindergarten, her gap-toothed grin bright enough to light up the darkest day. She was the reason he'd left the police force after his wife died. The irregular hours and emotional toll had become impossible to manage as a single parent. Private investigation work paid better and offered more flexibility, but cases like this one reminded him why he'd sometimes preferred chasing drug dealers to delving into the messy complications of ordinary people's lives. Carmen returned with his coffee, the ceramic mug chipped along the rim but clean. Her smile was genuine, if tired, and she asked if he needed anything else with the kind of attention to detail that suggested she genuinely cared about doing her job well. Logan found himself hoping that his suspicions were wrong, that there was some other explanation for the missing money. But hope and evidence were two different things, and he was here to collect the latter. The breakfast rush began in earnest around 7:30, bringing with it a steady stream of construction workers, office employees, and retired folks who had made Miller's Corner Cafe part of their daily routine. Logan watched Carmen work, noting how she interacted with the regular customers, remembering their usual orders, asking about their families. She wasn't just competent, she was genuinely good at this job. That made what happened next all the more painful to witness. At 8:15, a businessman in an expensive suit left a $20 bill on a $12 check, clearly intending it as a generous tip. Carmen cleared the table efficiently, stacking plates and wiping down the surface. Logan activated his phone's recording app as she handled the money. Instead of taking the full $8 to the tip jar by the register, he watched her palm 2 of the bills, sliding them into her apron pocket with movements so smooth they would have been easy to miss if he hadn't been specifically watching for them. His finger pressed the record button as he documented the time, table number, and estimated amount taken. This was the moment, the evidence that would close the case, satisfy his client, and probably cost Carmen her job. But something made him hesitate about what to do next. Maybe it was the way she glanced toward the kitchen with an expression of pure anxiety. Maybe it was how her hand shook slightly as she poured coffee for the next table. Or maybe it was the photograph he could see sticking out of her apron pocket. A little girl who couldn't have been much older than Zoe, with Carmen's dark eyes and a smile that looked too grown up for her age. Over the next 2 hours, Logan documented 3 more instances of Carmen skimming money from tips. Never the full amount, always leaving something for the communal jar, but enough to add up to real money over time. Each instance was carefully noted in his observation log with precise time stamps and amounts. The evidence was clear and undeniable. Carmen Rodriguez was stealing from her co-workers, and Logan had it all documented. But what bothered him wasn't the theft itself. It was the way she did it, with obvious reluctance, constantly checking to make sure no one was watching, and with an expression that suggested she was fighting an internal battle every single time. This wasn't the behavior of someone comfortable with stealing. This was the behavior of someone who had run out of other options. At 9:30, during a brief lull between the breakfast and early lunch crowds, Carmen stepped into the narrow hallway that led to the restaurant's single restroom to take a phone call. Logan could hear her voice through the thin walls, though he made sure not to activate his recording device. Even in his investigation work, he drew lines about privacy in certain areas. "I know the payment's late, Dr. Mitchell. I'm trying to get the money together. Sophia's been asking about her next appointment, and I keep having to tell her we need to wait a little longer. She's only 4. She doesn't understand why Mommy can't make the hurt go away." Logan felt his chest tighten as Carmen's voice carried through the hallway. When she moved back into the dining area, still talking, he could see the strain in her posture as she continued. "The insurance company is still fighting the claim. They say the treatment is experimental, that there are cheaper alternatives. But you and I both know those alternatives haven't been working. Please, just give me another week. I'll have the money. I promise." When Carmen returned to work, her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She went straight back to serving customers with the same professional demeanor she'd maintained all morning. But Logan could see the weight she was carrying now, the way her shoulders seemed to bow under an invisible burden. His phone contained clear documentation of theft. His client expected a report by the end of the week. His job was to present the facts and let others decide what to do with them. But sitting in that worn vinyl booth, watching a young mother struggle with impossible choices, Logan found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about justice. The lunch crowd brought its own rhythm to the cafe. Carmen moved between tables with renewed energy, perhaps motivated by the knowledge that lunch tips were generally better than breakfast ones. Logan watched her carefully count and recount the money left on each table, and he saw her take small amounts from 2 different tips over the course of an hour. But he also saw something else. When an elderly man at table 6 seemed confused about his check, Carmen spent 10 minutes patiently explaining the charges and helping him figure out which medications might be affecting his memory. When a young mother with 2 small children struggled to keep them entertained while waiting for their food, Carmen brought coloring books from behind the counter and spent her break helping the kids draw pictures of their family. These weren't the actions of someone who didn't care about others. These were the actions of someone who understood what it meant to struggle, who recognized the signs of people who needed a little extra kindness in their day. Logan's phone buzzed with a text from his babysitter, asking if he'd be home in time to take Zoe to her doctor's appointment. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, documenting another parent's desperate attempt to pay for medical care, while his own daughter waited for him to navigate the same complex world of healthcare and insurance and endless paperwork. At 1:15, Logan made a decision that surprised him. Instead of continuing his surveillance, he walked to the counter where Carmen was inputting an order into the ancient point-of-sale system. "Excuse me," he said, pulling out his private investigator's license. "I need to speak with you privately." The color drained from Carmen's face. She looked around the restaurant as if calculating escape routes, then back at Logan with the expression of someone who had been expecting this moment, but hoping it would never come. "I know about the tips," Logan said quietly. "I have detailed documentation, multiple instances over the past 2 days." Carmen's knees seemed to buckle slightly. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself, and Logan could see her hands trembling. "Please," she whispered. "I can explain. I can pay it back. I just need—" "Sophia's medical bills," Logan finished for her. "I heard your phone call earlier." The admission seemed to break something inside Carmen. Tears began streaming down her face, and she covered her mouth with one hand as if trying to hold back words that had been building pressure for months. "She has juvenile arthritis," Carmen said, her voice barely audible. "The doctor says if we don't get her the right treatment now, while she's young, she could have permanent joint damage, but the insurance company keeps denying coverage, and the out-of-pocket cost is $1,500 a month. I make $8.50 an hour plus tips. Even working double shifts, it's not enough." Logan felt something twist in his chest. In his jacket pocket, his observation notes documented everything: Carmen's desperate situation, the amounts taken, the clear pattern of behavior. "I never meant for it to go this far," she continued. "At first I was just going to borrow a little bit and pay it back when my tax refund came. But Sophia got worse, and the treatments got more expensive, and I kept telling myself it was just temporary. I know it's wrong. I know I'm stealing from people who work just as hard as I do. But she's my baby, and I don't know what else to do." Logan looked at this young mother, probably not much older than his wife had been when Zoe was born, and saw his own desperation reflected back at him. The sleepless nights wondering if he was making the right choices, the constant calculations of time and money and need, the weight of being solely responsible for another person's future. "How much do you owe for the next treatment?" he asked. Carmen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of mascara across her cheek. $800. The appointment is next Friday, and if I can't pay, they'll have to reschedule. But Dr. Mitchell said we can't wait much longer without risking permanent damage." Logan looked at his phone, at the detailed notes he'd taken, at the evidence that could destroy this woman's life. Then he made a decision that went against every principle of professional investigation he'd learned in 20 years of law enforcement. He deleted the audio recordings he'd made. Carmen stared at him in confusion, as if she couldn't quite process what she'd just witnessed. "The recordings are gone," Logan said firmly. "But I still have my written observations, and I still have to file a report with Ray." But he wasn't done. Over the next 20 minutes during Carmen's break, Logan learned more about her situation than any case file could have contained. Sophia's father had died in a construction accident when she was 2, a scaffolding collapse that the investigation had ruled accidental, though Carmen suspected the general contractor had cut corners on safety equipment. The life insurance payout had been minimal, and mounting medical bills had consumed what little savings they'd had. Carmen's own parents lived in Mexico and couldn't help financially. She'd applied for every assistance program available, but the waiting lists were long and the bureaucracy was overwhelming. The insurance company's denial of coverage hinged on a technicality about experimental treatments, even though Dr. Mitchell had explained that the newer medications were far more effective than older alternatives. "I keep thinking about what Sophia's dad would say if he knew what I'd become," Carmen said, staring at her hands. "He was so proud, so honest. He would have found another way. He would have done exactly what you're doing," Logan said without hesitation. He would have moved heaven and earth to take care of his daughter. But understanding Carmen's motivation didn't solve the underlying problem. She still needed money for Sophia's treatment, and she still worked in a job that barely covered their basic living expenses. Logan couldn't ignore his professional obligation entirely, but he also couldn't walk away from a situation that so clearly called for something beyond simple law enforcement. That's when he remembered something Ray Thompson had mentioned during their initial meeting. The cafe owner had been struggling to find reliable help, particularly someone who could work the early morning shift and handle some basic bookkeeping tasks. The pay would be significantly better than straight waitressing, and it might provide the kind of financial stability Carmen needed. Logan found Ray in the back office, hunched over a pile of invoices that looked like it hadn't been touched in weeks. The older man looked up with the expression of someone who was hoping for good news, but expecting the worst. "I finished my investigation," Logan said, settling into the folding chair across from Ray's desk. "I found who's been taking the tip money." Ray's face fell. "One of my girls?" "Carmen Rodriguez. But before you do anything, I need you to hear the whole story." Over the next 15 minutes, Logan laid out everything he'd learned about Carmen's situation, her daughter's medical needs, and the impossible choice she'd been facing between her integrity and her child's health. He showed Ray his detailed observation notes, including the amounts Carmen had taken and the pattern of her behavior. He watched Ray's expression shift from disappointment to understanding to something that looked like determination. "How much has she taken total?" Ray asked when Logan finished. "Based on my observations and her admission, probably around $200 over the past month. She's willing to pay it back through payroll deduction." "And how much is she short for the treatment?" $800 for next Friday, $1,500 a month going forward." Ray was quiet for a long moment, staring at a photograph on his desk of his own grandchildren. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You know, I've been putting off hiring an assistant manager because I couldn't justify the salary increase. But maybe it's time to reorganize things around here. Carmen's good with people. She knows the business and she's clearly motivated to work hard." Logan felt something ease in his chest. What kind of salary increase are we talking about? Enough to cover most of that $1,500 a month after taxes, plus overtime opportunities during busy periods. And I've got some connections with other business owners in town, people who might be able to help with one-time expenses when they come up. It wasn't a perfect solution. Carmen would still be working hard for every dollar, still navigating the complexities of healthcare and insurance, still carrying the weight of single parenthood. But it was a chance, a real opportunity to build something sustainable instead of just surviving day to day. When they called Carmen into the office, her face was pale with anxiety. She clearly expected to be fired, possibly arrested, definitely humiliated in front of her employer. Instead, Ray offered her a promotion. "Assistant manager comes with a significant pay increase," he explained, "plus additional responsibilities, scheduling, some bookkeeping, training new staff. It's not going to be easy work, but I think you can handle it. And to address the missing tip issue, we're implementing a new policy. All tips will go into a monitored pool and be distributed equally among the wait staff at the end of each shift." Carmen looked between Ray and Logan as if trying to process words that didn't quite make sense. "I don't understand." "You know what I did. You have proof." "I have proof that you're a mother who would do anything to take care of her child," Logan said. "And Ray has a business that needs someone reliable and dedicated to help run it. The amount you've taken will be deducted from your first few paychecks, but that's between you and Ray." The silence stretched for several seconds before Carmen broke down completely. Not the quiet tears from earlier, but the kind of sobbing that comes from months of held breath finally being released. Ray passed her the box of tissues he kept on his desk for difficult conversations, and Logan found himself thinking about his own daughter, about the kind of help he'd wish for if their situations were reversed. The new tip policy would serve multiple purposes. It protected all employees from future accusations while ensuring fair distribution of gratuities. It also provided Ray with a face-saving explanation for the other staff members who had complained about missing money. But implementation wouldn't be without challenges. The next morning, Logan observed from his usual booth as Ray held a staff meeting before the breakfast rush. 3 waitresses and 2 kitchen staff gathered around the counter as Ray explained the new pooled tip system. "This isn't about punishing anyone," Ray said carefully. "It's about creating a more equitable system where everyone benefits from good service regardless of which tables they're assigned." Brenda, a waitress in her 50s who had worked at the cafe for over a decade, crossed her arms. "So the new girl gets the same tips as those of us who've been building relationships with customers for years. The new girl has a name, and she's your new assistant manager." Ray replied firmly. "Carmen will be handling scheduling, inventory, and training. She's earned this position through her dedication and work ethic." Logan watched the dynamics play out, noting the subtle tension between staff members. Change was never easy, especially when people suspected there was more to the story than they were being told. But Ray handled the questions with patience, emphasizing the business benefits of the new system rather than dwelling on the problems it was designed to solve. Carmen herself remained quiet during the meeting, her new title still seeming surreal. When the breakfast rush began, Logan observed how she navigated her dual role, serving tables while also monitoring the cash register and helping resolve small conflicts between staff members. The real test came around 10 a.m., when Mrs. Henderson, a regular customer who typically left generous tips specifically for Carmen, expressed confusion about the new policy. "I've been coming here for 3 years, the elderly woman said, "and I always make sure Carmen gets a little extra because she remembers how I like my coffee. Are you telling me that money goes to everyone now?" Carmen handled the question with grace, explaining that good service was a team effort and that she appreciated Mrs. Henderson's loyalty, regardless of how the tips were distributed. But Logan could see the additional pressure this created. Carmen now had to justify the new system to customers who had developed personal relationships with her. By lunchtime, the new rhythm was beginning to establish itself. The pooled tips were counted and divided among the staff at the end of each shift, with Ray overseeing the process to ensure transparency. Carmen's managerial duties kept her busy enough that the loss of individual tip control seemed less significant. But Logan also noticed something else developing. Marcus, one of the kitchen staff, had begun making subtle comments about favoritism and wondering aloud why someone who had caused problems was getting promoted. The tension was manageable for now, but it suggested that Ray and Carmen would need to prove the wisdom of their decision through consistent performance rather than just good intentions. 3 weeks later, Logan returned to Miller's Corner Cafe, this time as a genuine customer rather than an investigator. The changes were immediately apparent. Carmen moved through the restaurant with the confidence of someone who belonged there, handling both customer service and management tasks with equal skill. The tip pooling system had become routine, and the staff seemed to have accepted the new normal. When Carmen approached his table, she smiled. Not the tired, professional smile from before, but something genuine and warm. "How's Sophia?" he asked when she brought his coffee. "Better every day," Carmen replied. "The new treatment is working, and Dr. Mitchell says if we can keep this up for another 6 months, she should be able to switch to a maintenance plan that's much more affordable." Logan nodded, stirring sugar into his coffee and watching Carmen return to her work. She moved differently now, still efficient, still attentive to customers, but without the underlying tension that had marked her every gesture during his investigation. As he prepared to leave, Carmen approached his table one more time. "I never properly thanked you," she said quietly, "for what you did, for what you chose not to do." Logan thought about his response for a moment, then pulled out his phone and showed her the same photo of Zoe that he'd been looking at during his investigation. "I did what any parent would hope someone else would do for their child," he said simply. Walking back to his car, Logan realized that this case had changed something fundamental about how he approached his work. Justice wasn't always about catching people doing wrong. Sometimes it was about understanding why people made desperate choices and finding ways to address the underlying problems. His phone buzzed with a message from a potential new client, a corporation wanting him to investigate employee theft at their warehouse. Logan looked at the message, then back at the cafe where Carmen was helping train a new waitress, and made a decision about what kinds of cases he wanted to prioritize going forward. Some investigations were about finding the truth. Others were about finding ways to help people build better truths for themselves. Logan had learned the difference, and it would guide every case he took from this point forward. The written documentation he'd compiled would have been damaging evidence in a traditional investigation. The solution he'd helped create, instead, had been something more valuable, a chance for redemption, for growth, for a small family to find solid ground in an uncertain world. As he drove home to pick up Zoe from school, Logan found himself thinking about the choices all parents face, the lengths they'll go to protect their children, and the kind of world he wanted to help create for the next generation. Carmen's story wasn't unique. There were countless families struggling with impossible decisions, caught between doing what was right and doing what was necessary. But perhaps, one case at a time, one family at a time, those impossible choices could become a little more possible. Perhaps that was the real work of justice, not just punishing people for their failures, but helping them find ways to succeed. The photograph of Zoe on his dashboard smiled back at him as he drove through the afternoon sunlight, and Logan Hayes knew he'd found a new definition of what it meant to serve and protect. Tomorrow, he would start reviewing his client list, focusing on cases where investigation could lead to resolution rather than just revelation. Some stories ended with arrests and prosecutions. This one ended with a little girl getting the medical care she needed, and a mother finding a path forward that didn't require choosing between her integrity and her child's health. Logan decided he preferred this kind of ending.